Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's really, really nice to be able to present together with Richard in this one panel, because we started talking, we met in Winnipeg in Canada, and we immediately had this connection on the sources that really needed to speak to each other and the context that we wanted to give to our research and giving that oxygen. And so I'm really happy about that, and it was a perfect introduction, so I can shorten certain things in my talk also thanks to this. So really happy about this. Now Antwerp, it all depends on the time frame, as we've heard, and the point of reference that we have done. So British Allied forces liberated Antwerp on the 4th of September 1944. American, Canadian and Polish troops followed in their wake and engaging in a battle to defend the strategic Western European port city, which fell under severe bombings from October 1944 through March 1945. And as we can see on these pictures, the Allies enter the city and the local population welcomes their liberators, throws a Hitler-like doll in the air, and Allies and locals get in contact with each other. Now, a day before Antwerp, Brussels was liberated by the Brigade Piron, the Belgian military which operated under the command of the British 6th Airborne Division, which was part of the 1st Canadian Army. Now, this division counted quite a few Belgian Jews among its forces, and the most famous one being Baron Jean Bloch. Among these troops were also Jews from Antwerp, and like David Izbutsky. And Antwerp-born David Izbutsky had entered the Belgian military on the 3rd of January 1939, but he escaped during the war and made his way to Cuba via Spain and Portugal, where he arrived on 17 December 1941. Together with 9 other young Jewish men from Belgium, he reported to the Belgian embassy in Cuba and was brought to a military training in Canada and consequently put into action with the Allied armies and taking part in the liberation of Belgium. He belonged to the Antwerp Orthodoxy, was since 1933 a member of the Bnei Akiva, so the soccer team which we see on the picture. When he came back in Belgium, he was fortunate to hear that his parents had survived and he had an emotional reunion with them. Not all were as fortunate as that, as the Dutch language Antwerp socialist newspaper Volksgazette reported in its issue of 7 September 1944, the story of a, to me, anonymous soldier. The title of the issue already forebodes the tragic account in the article. A Belgian soldier is coming home. He doesn't find his Jewish parents. The soldier in question had immediately rushed to his parents' house, and I quote, "For 4 years he had seen the living room, the kitchen, his bedroom in his imagination. When he appeared before the house, it was closed. No one came to answer his calls. Neighbors rushed outside and recognized him. Their greetings were warm, but their faces serious. They had to inform him that his parents had been taken away, that the furniture had been taken away. A soldier came home. Will he ever see his parents again?" Now, at the moment of the liberation of Antwerp and the immediate months following on the 4th of September, only a few hundred Jews lived in the city, of the estimated 35,500 from before the war, or at the eve of the war. They had survived in hiding in the city. Jewish life, which had been officially erased from the city by the Nazi regime and its collaborators, reorganized itself. Sources about this period from Jewish survivors are scarce and difficult to trace, and they include diaries, letters, and testimonies of Jewish troops, as Richard also mentioned. And these sources are scattered and often serendipitously identified in various different archives or even in private property. Now, in the immediate post-war period, it was very often the Jewish soldiers from the Allied forces who could assist the local Jewish communities. They were often, to their own surprise, much earlier and faster in contact with the survivors than the organized overseas welfare, organized mostly by the Joint. And also, they had a language in common with the local population, whereas English was not a common language then for all locals in Antwerp, Yiddish for the Jewish population was. And this led to the sort of interesting effect that especially Jews with Eastern European migrant origins could easily find a common language, or more easily than well-integrated Jews who were very acculturated. And so it was definitely, as Deborah Dashmore also mentioned, a Babel of languages in which conversations flourished. So the private Dov Stein already mentioned is one of the ones who also reports frequently about what he sees, and it's often these reports that are sources about this period and what was going on. And whereas not all the reports are very accurate or fully accurate, some are spot on. And I mean, Richard already mentioned one quote where certain things are definitely according to the facts, but others probably are more difficult to pinpoint to the facts. But it's very interesting to hear these reports from the Allied soldiers. Here we see the Tarkemoni book where they, mostly Americans on this page, I think, signed the guest book of the school where also the shelter was held. And the only other reports I found by third witnesses of this shelter, of people who were not being held there themselves, was, for example, the report of Romy Goldmoens, who came also back to Antwerp from London and then went back to London and reported about what he saw in Antwerp at the end of 1944. And amongst other things, his report has the following passage in it. So on his arrival, he immediately got in touch with the Jewish Defense Committee there. The Antwerp Committee address is 313 Lange Leemstraat, where the Jewish school used to be, so that's the Tarkemoni. And the large number of Jews are glad to sleep on the straw provided for that purpose there. The members of the Antwerp Committee are not known to him personally. They are working hard and well, and he is very satisfied with this organization. It is heartbreaking to see our friends there, and one can still see the fear in their faces after years of hiding and hardship. They all look old and decrepit and are completely demoralized. Middle-aged women look like old women of 80. In fact, they are levende lijken, like living corpses. End of quote. And it's very important to have these witnesses, these witness accounts from this period, because there is a huge time lag between the liberation of Antwerp and the liberation of the camps and the annihilation centers. And so this shock and the horror upon finding the Jews in Europe, who had been through years of hardship, persecution, hiding, often in very dire circumstances, are extremely important, as they are not yet corroborated by the later framing into the whole picture. As Richard also mentioned, this point of reference changes very quickly and quite dramatically. And also the fact that Allied GIs testified about it and found it important to report about it also encouraged local Jews to further write about it and testify about it. For example, Stein writes in his letters how the local population is encouraged to further document what is going on when he shows them his letters that are published in the forwards. And so that encourages them to also further put in their information, because the world needs to know. And what he also does is using his letters as communication network for information about family and friends of the local Jewish population they encounter. And so far, I think this aspect seems to have received little attention by those who studied Jewish encounters in liberated Europe. The first time I saw it explicitly addressed was in the work of Shifra Stahl, who's the daughter of David Stein, and who graciously shared her work in progress, which he would like to publish soon, on her father, and who spent 8 months in Antwerp from November 44 until June 45. And so he was here with the in Antwerp with the US Allied forces, and in her introduction to this not yet published book, she mentions how he used his letters, which were sent by military mail, to spread information and to provide information to relatives who are not here in Antwerp, but then in the US. And she also explains how he actually was able to get more information through via the Yiddish letters, because as long as it was in English, he did not know who would be the censor. When it was a Yiddish letter, the censor would most likely be a fellow Jew and therefore would be more lenient towards letting through this type of information, these simple words of this person is alive and is out there. And he incorporates his whole family in the US to also help him spread the news. And I quote from one of those letters that they then write back to him, and they say, "I don't think I need to tell you how thrilled some of these people were to get news of their mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, etc., especially so since this was the first word they had had in several years." And so you see on the slide a letter in Yiddish, which definitely does include the names and the whereabouts, the addresses, which was otherwise, for various reasons, harder to pass through if you would have written in English or via civilian mail. So Samuel Cass, the rabbi already mentioned by Richard, called it the great hunt, the overwhelming desire of liberated Jews to find their relatives, which is very understandable. And I would like to add too that David Stein, being Orthodox, also included in his correspondence the request for help, assistance by the magic words, "send me a package," which allowed for the family to send him a package with, for example, kosher food, which was not available at that time in Antwerp, which he then gladly gave to the local Jewish population. The other thing already mentioned by Richard with the services is that Allied Jewish GIs help not only provide for the most basic urgent care, but they also helped organize the first observances of Jewish holidays after the liberation. And in the case of France and Belgium, this was Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah in 1944, and Hanukkah. And Samuel Cass is on this picture. And it's very often that the services are mixed local Jewish population and Allied GIs. And Romy Goldmunds wrote about the Hanukkah service at the reception center in 1944, and I quote, "A Hanukkah service was organized to which Jewish officers and men of the British and American forces were invited. This was very successful and had a good effect on the morale of the unfortunate victims of Nazi oppression." Now, interestingly, the date of the liberation also mattered in the sense for that French and Belgian liberated Jews, they had the high holidays on Hanukkah in 1944. For the liberation of the concentration camp and annihilation centers, this took place after that, and their first Jewish holiday to be celebrated was Purim. And this leads to totally different characteristics of the marking of the first Jewish holidays, I think, as they are very different in character. And most likely this 1945 Purim celebration had the most Hitler presence ever. Even in the Orthodox children's home in Brussels, the Tiefenbrunner home, somebody was dressed up as Hitler for Purim 1945. What also struck the Allied troops was the Orthodox character of Antwerp Jewry. And so Herbert Weiner, an American Jewish officer, wrote about the shelter in Antwerp to the Jewish institutions in the United States, and I quote, "You should have seen the richness of a Jewish Sabbath here. You should have seen these people, some of whom kept kashrut throughout their captivity, praying. There is more Hebrew spoken here than in any of our seminaries. There is more pride in their Jewishness locked up in this shelter than in all of New York City." Unquote.
Bye.
The high holidays and other religious services were attended by both local and Allied Jews. Being in the male world of the army, the possibility to socialize with the local Jewish population also meant meeting young Jewish women. And so indeed some encounters led to romance, and quite a few couples were formed. This was also the case for Felicia Ramet in Antwerp. She met Ben Otis, a Canadian Jewish GI who served in the Air Force during the high holidays on Yom Kippur in 1944 in the Antwerp synagogue of the Oostenstraat. They fell in love, it was a coup de foudre, and she stayed in touch with him when he moved along to other places with his army unit. And this is absolutely not unusual. For example, in Paris, at least 5% of the Jewish weddings in 1945 were between allied Jewish GI and local Jewish women. In the meantime, as time goes by, we move from September to the end of March, beginning of April, when we see the first repatriation from the camps. And at that very moment, again, the need for news becomes really, really important. And Dossin, for example, has written so many letters to tell people about what he knew. He stuck to the facts. So he says here to Reb Shlomo Rothenberg, who's inquiring about his two cousins, the daughters of his sister, that they are not found on the other list. So he will have to write to him that these girls are on a deportation list. At the same time, this letter goes on the 18th of April, 45 to the US. On the 26th of April, probably crossing somewhere overseas, comes a letter from Reb Rothenberg himself, who also encourages Dov to go and check in Heide in Kalmthout, because he thinks that the girls have been hidden with Gentile population. And so it's really heartbreaking to then see that news comes in, and that he says, you know, I ask you, Leman Hashem, to see that everything possible is done to find the children. I can't beg you enough to do this. It would be at least a small-scale rescue, whereas the news that he sent just already tells the opposite. And what we also see in those letters is that basically the situation with the return of the few survivors gets worse, gets way worse, also on the morale. The survivors tell such horrible stories, and this is also what is being reported by Stein to his family, but also by Herbert Weiner, who I already also quoted. And he described the situation in the relief center in the Langeleemstraat in June 45 as followed. Yesterday I sat on a little cot, one of the many set up for those who have just returned from the death camps, while a young woman wandered through with a hopeless look in her eyes, asking if any children had yet come back. As you know, almost all the little Jewish children have been taken away and have been gassed. Little children, just like your son Zaki and your little girl Sid, were taken away, and none of them are coming back. I know you have read all this, but you haven't seen this mother wandering through and asking if any children have yet come back. And the worst part of it all is the way they answered her. As we would tell each other that it will rain tomorrow, so did they tell her that none had yet returned. Every day, a new creature resembling a human being wanders into the shelter dressed in some rags he has torn off the body of a dead German dog, but no children come back. No one comforted the mother. There was no heart to feel with her, but because every single heart there was broken. And so it continues in that way. And these reports are the ones that we do not have before. And so it definitely did not make the local population hopeful to see the return of their deported loved ones. The Ramet woman, mother Sura and daughter Felicia, had been waiting for months to receive any news about their spouse, father Yutka, and son, brother Nathan. Hope was scarce. However, on 23 May 45, Nathan returned to Antwerp, having survived multiple camps and the death marches. And not knowing whether Yutka and Nathan would ever return, and if so, when, Felicia and Otis were married just 1 week before, on 15 May 1945. And the couple will then move later onwards to Canada. Now, what we also see is that the Orthodox GIs will also act like a pressure group to encourage the aid associations to take into account the needs, and especially the needs of Orthodox Jews, which were not typically at the first thought of some of the aid organizations, as they were not all Orthodox organizations. And it also brings us, these letters, an insight into the Orthodox life in all its daily aspects, about which prayers they went to, which synagogues they went to. Dossin, for example, sent also home memorabilia. So he sent home parts of the burned Torah scrolls from the Antwerp pogrom of 1941. He also was able to send home the tefillin and a star really worn by people during the war. And so this is really an important source of information. He reports about the first kosher meat in Antwerp. He reports about how an Orthodox Jew goes to Brussels to buy it with the first kosher shochet, and then when finally the first kosher meal is served into the refugee center. He reports about the Jewish schools, about how they organize it, how they organize the studying of Torah. He reports about the children's question and about how that can all be taken care of according to their view, which is very different than the other organizations. And what I want to also stress to conclude is that we also don't have to see it as a one-way street. As much as the Allied GIs helped the local Jewish population, the local Jewish population also provided, especially these Orthodox GIs, with a home-like feeling. Mm-hmm. As we see here in the picture, Dossin with little Eli Ringer at his hand, and on the other picture, the Ringer children and the mother. He really writes home that he said that he had to confess that it was hard for me to remember that I wasn't at home. So he really spent a lot of Shabbat meals there rather than in the Kazerne. And they don't regard me as a soldier, but as one of the members in Shul, that is them. They even offered to make me the gabbai. For meals these days, I go quite regularly to the Ringer home, where the Yiddishkeit and warm hospitality are exactly like home. So I think it's really important that we also stress that this was a two-way street or a multiple-way street, and that is extremely enriching for not only the local view here, but also the view within the ones who study the armies that went to liberate Europe, that we need to connect. And so therefore I strongly support what Richard has mentioned on trying to engage a scholarly community around this topic to further allow that our knowledge expands and that we can make further analysis beyond one country, beyond one city. So thank you very much.